Hey guys, I'm Matt Lighty, and this video I wanted to talk about Uber Pinnacle bosses. Now, Uber Pinnacle bosses were introduced in 3.18. It's 7 upgraded variations of existing Pinnacle bosses, or some of the highest endgame bosses in Path, that are all accessible and upgradable through Atlas passive keystones. These fights are labeled as extremely difficult, and some of them are, but some of them are really not much more difficult than the current versions of the bosses. Now, in the upcoming patch 3.20, all of these bosses, except for Elder, are receiving new uniques. So I thought this was a good opportunity to showcase at least a little brief overview of what they are, what they currently have, how to access them, and then just what it looks like to fight them. So Uber Pinnacle bosses are broken down into, again, 7 different boss fights. You have Uber Venarius, which is the Cortex, Uber Eater of Worlds, Uber Maven, Uber Searing Exarch, Uber Sirus, the Awakener of Worlds, Uber Shaper, and then the funniest of them is Uber Elder, which is Uber Pinnacle Elder, which is the fight where you actually fight Shaper and Elder, but it's not the same as Shaper. It's actually the similar one. Now, all these fights have a base additional difficulty of it being slightly higher idle level, goes from 83 to 85 in most cases, and they have this blanket 75% reduced damage taken. Now, their base stats are also increased, which is sometimes problematic, because a lot of their auto attacks will hit for more life than your character has post-mitigation. But the main thing is their mechanics shift, ever so slightly in some and massively in others. Now, an additional incentive to do Uber Pinnacle bosses is each of them have roughly a 1% chance to drop their respective Reliquary Keys. These keys, one of which you'll see in the video later on, again as a drop, basically let you get one more drop on their pool, but it's shiny. It's the equivalent of shiny Pokemon in Path of Exile. So say you kill Shaper, he's a 1 in 100 chance of dropping the Shaper Reliquary Key, and that key is going to access a chest in an instanced area. That'll give you one item you would have gotten from Shaper, any of his drops. It is definitely weighted, and it'll just be shiny. No different, just shiny. So if you like collecting shinies, that's kind of an added incentive. And then if not, the actual keys themselves do sell sometimes for a pretty penny. But sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't. It's a little fun extra, little extra gift for doing Uber Pinnacle bosses. We're going to start with Uber Venarius, or the Cortex. Now, the main things it is when you unlock the Memento Mori keystone, the Cortex eye level becomes 85. It says Venarius' full power is unleashed in the Cortex. Venarius drops 3 additional rare items with 3 less common synthesized implicit modifiers. So that's the big benefit, is when you defeat Uber Cortex, he's going to guarantee drop 3 synth items. They're going to be level I-85. They're going to all have 3 synthesis implicits, and they're going to be less common, meaning they're smart rolled. So what that means is basically, picture it rolls, randomly picks 10 implicits and takes the rarest one. That's the one it'll pick for each slot, give or take. Currently, Uber Cortex has no specific unique drop to it, but it will be gaining it in 3.20. The main difficulty spike with Uber Cortex comes with the fact that when he summons bosses in the 5 sections, instead of summoning 1 at a time, he summons 2 at a time. This plus the 70% reduced damage taken that the event has, just for being an Uber Pinnacle boss, and the fact that Cortex has such a massive range of fluctuation in difficulty, because you could have random modifiers that say they have a 90% chance to not be ailmented, for example, can really brick a lot of builds, or things like them gaining 180% more life. So Cortex is simultaneously the easiest of the Uber Pinnacles and the hardest, depending on your RNG. Next up is Uber Eater of Worlds. This is unlocked from the Insatiable Appetite Keystone. Now what that does is it makes the instance level 85. It has the blanket 75% reduced damage taken. The full power is unleashed, whatever that means. And the big thing, it has a 25% chance to drop an additional exceptional Eldritch Ichor. So if it drops one, it'll drop an additional a fourth of the time. This also unlocks its current unique drop, which it's technically nothing new. It is basically a additional subset of ascendancies tied behind this boss. So the Forbidden Flesh aspect he drops can give you ascendancies only accessible through doing Eater and Searing Exarch. So one of each side. Now, this fight is actually one of the more difficult ones. The main thing that you'll notice in this fight is his beam he shoots out has insane tracking and shoots in triplets much more frequently. All of his slam abilities and tentacle abilities are basically amplified to, instead of occur in a singular tentacle. It's like a round tentacle. He does tentacle slams in the middle of the ball phase, so this fight's quite hectic. Thankfully, kind of like Exarch, you could basically just one-shot him on paper. If you do mass amounts of damage for him, he'll typically phase, but nothing preventing you from just unloading damage compared to something like we just discussed Cortex, which has especially 5 phases. So you're kind of soft locked into doing it at a certain amount of time. Eater of Worlds and Searing Exarch you could kind of just burn through. This fight really scales up difficulty when you start crafting the invitation. Giving it additional speed is the real killer in AoE, because its current speed and AoE are definitely cranked up to 11 in the Uber Pinnacle version. Next up is the Uber Maven. This is unlocked from the Throw the Gauntlet keystone. So the Absence of Mercy, its area is level 85. It has the negative 70% damage taken. Its full power is unleashed. And the big part, and why this is probably the most important of all the Ubers for consistent money as of right now, is it guaranteed drops an elevated sextant every time you kill it, which is great because a lot of these bosses, although being more difficult, don't have a guaranteed reward such as this. You also have the potential of getting Awakened, Empower, Enlightened, Enhance, which instead of naturally going to 3 and corrupt into 4, naturally go to 4 and can corrupt to 5. Maven will also be receiving a additional unique in 3.20. Uber Maven is, without question, the easiest of the Uber Pinnacle bosses. The difficulty that you notice from this fight really is almost strictly stemmed to the 70% reduced damage taken that they all have. The longer the fight goes on, the more mistakes you make. If you just have a lot of damage, this fight is a piss walk. The main notable thing is she'll do the fireball ability throughout the fight periodically, and it has some sort of awakened GMP. Her Cascade of Pain, her main ability that kills you, has LMP hooked up to it. All of the dots in the ground no longer dissolve between phases. They persist permanently, so you have to make sure you drop them in the center appropriately. And that's the main gist of the fight. She'll periodically summon bosses throughout the fight and exiles, but they're really not of any consequence. If you have the damage to Uber Maven, if you could do regular Maven mechanically, you should have no issue doing the Uber variation if you have, we'll say, 10 to 20 single target damage. That's a million, by the way, not flat 10 to 20. Next up is Searing Exarch. Again, it's probably up there for the most difficult of the Uber Pinnacle bosses. He's unlocked from the Thirst for Knowledge keystone. The area is 85. The damage penalty of 70% is active. His full power is unleashed. And Eldritch currency items dropped by him have a 50% chance to be duplicated. So if he drops an Eldritch Chaos, he'll a 50-50, he drops 2. That's kind of the meme. Again, his Forbidden Flame has access to notable keystones and ascendancies that don't currently exist in the game. I assume, again, Path of Exile 2 ones. If you get one that's specific to the Forbidden Flame from Uber, you have to get the matching variant from Eater, and it is very difficult. So I would say the main aspect of Exarch that makes him hard is the ball phase, is hyper elevated. There's way more balls, there's way more waves, and in the middle of it, he spawns this Minotaur that is arguably more dangerous than he is. This Minotaur is chunky, extremely tanky, extremely deadly, hits extremely hard. You basically have to kill it before the phase ends or the fight starts getting real fucky. I wouldn't really enter this fight without 20 to 30 mil single target because it gets really crazy if the fight progresses on. The ground starts to fill with fire. Dodging his basic abilities isn't difficult, and if you have any respectable amount of fire res or base hit reduction like Fortify or Suppression, him himself doesn't really do that much damage. The Minotaur slaps and you're going to die to the balls. That's the big ones. Max single target and mechanical knowledge should basically let you bypass this fight's difficulty with appropriate levels of fire res and armor. Similar to Eater, as I would put them both as probably the second hardest, kind of tied for second for most difficult boss fight. There is huge gaps in difficulty, I would say, amongst the Pinnacle bosses, and the number one spot is coming up next for a variety of reasons. So next we have Uber Sirus, the Awakener of Worlds. He is, I think, without question, the most difficult or most flagrantly disrespectful of the Uber Pinnacle bosses. And he is unlocked from the Perfect Storm keystone, which is so aptly named, and why the fight gets so fucked. The zone is level 85, he takes 70% reduced damage like the others, and his full power is unleashed in the Eye of the Storm. The part that's, I guess, nice is he has a 20% chance to drop Awakened support gems, and this does include ones intrinsically locked behind the Maven. You can get tier 1 Awakened gems off him, such as Multi-Strike Chain. You can't get the Awakened Empower and Enlightened Enhance, those are Uber Maven only. The big thing he has is when he drops a Thread of Hope, there is roughly a 10% chance, or is it, I think it's a 2% base chance, not very high, At the Threat of Hope will roll into a massive one versus the normal small, medium, large, extra large type thing. Now, if it rolls massive, you cannot divine it. You cannot change its roll. It will roll out of massive. If you have a regular thread drop off of Uber Sirus, you cannot roll into massive. Whatever massive you get is the massive you get. Massive thread unlocks a lot of interesting things on the Atlas passive tree. So the regular passive tree. There's a lot of really optimal setups with a massive thread, so it is something that's quite desirable. He also will be receiving a new unique come 3.20. Here's the bad part. The bad part about Uber Sirus comes with how the fight is designed. Already designed to basically obfuscate your vision, terrible scream clutter, a lot of things in the ground, very low opportunity for damage uptime. Now keep that in mind. High life pool, 70% reduced damage. The longer this fight goes on, the worse the arena gets. Periodically spawning storms in the midst of phase 4, increasing the amount of beams that spawn, increasing the ground degen. This fight is a clusterfuck. If you do not kill Uber Sirus fast, the fight will very quickly get away from you and essentially make it so the arena itself is nigh impossible to progress through. I would not recommend fighting Uber Sirus without at least 30 to 40 mil single target, and just know that if you do die, getting back to the fight is worse than ever. Next up we have Uber Shaper, which I would probably tie for the easiest behind Maven, although it itself I think has a higher gear check. Now Uber Shaper is unlocked from the Cosmic Wounds keystone, which is the same keystone that actually unlocks Uber Elder. We'll get to him next. Uber Shaper is level 85 arena, has 70% reduced damage taken, as the rest, and its full power is unleashed when the keystone is unlocked. The big thing from Uber Shaper is that when he does the bullet hell phase, the P.O ball phase, there is no bubble. Now, that may sound intimidating, but if you have proper cold mitigation, spell suppression, fortify, that sort of stuff, he doesn't typically hit you that many times in this phase. If you stick to a corner and kind of just like run back and forth, you'll probably dodge the vast majority of balls taken. And again, with having a Sapphire up, suppression, fortify, that sort of stuff, they typically do about 2,000 to 3,000 damage per hit. So if you're, quick with your flask, you could just kind of tank it. There's a chance he could spawn on you and basically Nova shock you with all the balls at once. That can happen. Aside from that, the fight is essentially the same. His balls have LMP, and it's just as easy to dodge. You stand by his side, you stand on his back, and typically it's not a big deal. His slam is much quicker, but there's still plenty of room to dodge it. Once you get used to Uber Shaper, the slam feels like it's moving super slow, the ball's not a problem, and every go from Uber Shaper to doing regular Shaper, it feels like he's moving in quicksand, like he has 90% reduced action speed. It's comical. The big thing that he drops is the Sublime Vision. This is a new unique that is a jewel that is specific auras have these enhanced effects. An example is Wrath always applying sap and having increased effect. The downside is it's the only aura you could use. So typically singular aura stacking builds run Sublime Vision. Great examples are Hatred because it gives you automatic brittle. He will also be receiving a new unique in 3.20. And next and final is the Uber Elder, or Uber Pinnacle Elder, unlocked from the Cosmic Wounds keystone, similar to Shaper. He's got an 85 zone, 70% reduced damage taken. And the big thing with him is that you're fighting Shaper Elder at once, and they're both kind of stronger. Shaper still has his LMP balls, and Shaper still has the Bullet Hell phase. Elder's basically the same. Not much of a noticeable difference. The fight's quite easy. I would put it up there with the same thing with Shaper and Maven. If you could do the regular version and you have at least 20 mil damage, you should have no problem doing the Uber Pinnacle version. So Uber Elder has two drops that are unique to the Pinnacle Uber variation. You have the existing item Presence, which gains a new upgraded version. The new version has, instead of one aura, it is two auras. You have the main thematic damaging aura, then a second functional aura. This example is Vuln and Punishment. There are a couple combination of these. Kind of cool going into a curse patch. We're about to have an upgrade to all curse things, so it's kind of cool to see these aura things being used. The second thing is the unique that is, well, unique to Uber Elder, which is Soul Ascension. These gloves were made by community member Zizaran, and these give you Soul Eater when hitting unique enemies with some drawbacks. The idea is to basically ramp against unique enemies on hit-based builds. Kind of cool for bossing, seems to be effectively worthless everywhere else, so they do have a niche usage and also have roughly a 2% drop rate. He will not be receiving a unique in 3.20, as he already has the gloves. So that's a brief overview of all the Uber Pinnacle bosses. It's a good time now to learn how to do them, prior to the new league, or at least have a good idea going in. All these bosses, there are a variety of builds you could use to kill them. In the video you've been watching, I've been using Death Wish, which is the Maw of Mischief Golem Detonate Dead build. It basically detonates the golems and does a big ignite. I have roughly 40 to 50 million single target on this build. I'm using a Mage Blood, which covers my defenses, but you have 6 portals. If you didn't have Mage Blood, you could just use whatever, and you have the same amount of damage. There's no shortage of builds that do 50 million single target damage. It could be Seismic Track, it could be Explosive Trap, it could be Mine builds, you could be doing General's Cry, Berserker. Again, the list can go on. Single target is not a crazy thing to get in Path of Exile right now. What I would recommend, if anything, is if you want to tackle Uber Pinnacle bosses in the next league, I would suggest playing a mapping build that transitions into a bossing build. Get your character to a nice level, like 96, 97, shouldn't be too difficult. Then transition into some bossing, fill out your Atlas tree, etc. Because again, once you have single target damage, these bosses become quite trivial, and it's more about learning the mechanics, which is probably better for you as a player anyway. Makes you like, a healthier Path of Exile player if you learn the mechanics and just can dodge things manually with 3k life. So yeah, just to do one final recap, these are the 7 Uber Pinnacle bosses. We went over basically their basic abilities, their setups, the keystones, their names, their loose drops, and all of them except for Uber Elder is receiving a new unique coming as soon as 3.20. Technically, they could delay shit because, well, they want to. That being said, right now, I think it is totally fine to do and practice on things such as the Maven, and especially things such as Uber Elder, to get your build in a good position, to get your mechanics up. And if possible, I would suggest saving any attempts you have in the other ones until their new uniques are introduced, just to maximize your value. Of everything introduced in the Uber Pinnacle section, I think the thing that honestly has the highest value for me as a player is probably the Massive Thread of Hope. That or possibly Sublime Vision. Those are the ones, for some reason, I think that actually are the best. Although things are really cool, like the Two Presences or the Soul Ascension Gloves are specific Forbidden Flesh and Flames that might enable abilities. Things like the Massive Thread and things like Sublime Visions kind of just are more generically insane items as far as Path of Exile builds goals. I mean, technically, this is kind of harkening back to the old days of going all in on a specific aura, like using Synthesis Rings. So I would try to get yourself a Sublime Vision if you're a solo Southbound collector, especially that and a Massive Thread. And I would imagine that the different variations of Sublime and any sort of Massive Thread will be used on multiple builds to come in the future. So I look forward to seeing what new uniques they add. Let me know what you guys think of the Uber Pinnacle bosses. Have you done any? Is it so far out of your reach? We know roughly metrically that less than 0.1% of the player base has even engaged with them, let alone actively farms them. So this is a very, very, very high-end type of content, the highest the game has currently to offer. The vast majority of people will not get to experience this, but for those who do, I'd love to hear what you have to say. And I look forward to showing you guys what the Uber Pinnacle bosses have when they get their new uniques, because I have a lot of attempts in Standard to run these, and I look forward to farming all of them. So hope you have a good day. I've been Matt Lighty, and this has been a nice little informative video about Uber Pinnacle bosses. So see you guys in the next league, and I'll catch you around. Lighty out. Bye-bye.